It is April 29th, 2024, and as the pro-Palestinian protests continue to spread to universities across the U.S. with an ongoing crackdown going on, targeting everyone from students to faculty taking part in these overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations, well, you've got to wonder where that plan for a crackdown came from and who it's being supported by. Because if we look at who is involved here in the US, we see that it includes both Democrats and Republicans who have supported sending even more aid to Israel, even though Israel is very openly and plainly carrying out genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. Who also supports it? Oh, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who put out a video last week specifically calling for a crackdown. But the Biden administration isn't quite ready to admit that yet. They seem to be struggling to handle this entire situation, to put it lightly. We discuss the current tensions, where the protests stand, and how the movement of students in this country has had an impact on US policy for decades now, how it could have an impact on where tensions currently stand. We got into all that and more earlier with a special guest, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Saeed Arikat, a Palestinian journalist, Washington bureau chief for the Al-Quds daily newspaper, and an adjunct professor at American University. Saeed, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's always a pleasure.
It's always good to have you. And I want to get your take on the latest here, because I know that over 900 people have been arrested at pro-Palestinian protests at universities across the country since New York began targeting the original encampment at Columbia University earlier this month. Now, the more attention these demonstrations get, the more they seem to grow. What do you see as the significance of this overall movement that doesn't have just one leader, but it seems to be based around the idea of not only calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but also calling for universities to divest from anything related to Israel?
Yes, that's a great question, and it really is a great moment. I mean, I am old enough to remember the tail end of the the demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, and there was always, like you suggested, there was always an organizing body that made sure people were able to move, let's say, from Los Angeles to Washington and things like this, and organize and all these things. You always had a coalition group. But what we have seen with this movement is it's a spontaneity, and it reflects it reflects a genuine, first of all, being appalled by the level of death and destruction on the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the callous approach by the U.S. government and almost all its political bodies, the U.S. Congress, the Senate, all the other institutions, the almost dismissal approach by even the think tanks and institutions and so on. And it is obvious that these students, and let's not forget, actually, this movement has been going on since the very beginning. I mean, I remember on my campus, there was always a group of people here and there saying free Palestine, saying, ceasefire now. I mean, as far back as November and December and January, ceasefire now, and sending aid, military aid to Israel and so on. And what we have seen is basically the following, and that is not lost on the students, for sure. The students have always been, the most dynamic members of society. But what has been not lost on them is the fact that the United States is really just doubling down in terms of aid to Israel. We've seen this president not back away one iota from his total support to Israel, and the whole institution, the whole political establishment on both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans. We've seen them in addition to the $3.8 billion a year. We saw billions more. We saw $1 billion just 2 weeks ago. We saw $26 billion just approved last week. The bombs that are 2,000-pound bombs that destroy blocks, entire blocks, and so on. Many of them are not even exploded. They were probably, I don't know what's going to be the fate of these bombs and so on. So the students, and most people now, especially young people, are able to look at other sources of information and verify the credibility of these reports and react accordingly. I mean, students, how did this whole thing begin? I mean, the whole thing began was when Shafiq was actually supposed to testify in Congress along with the presidents of MIT and Harvard back in December, and she did not because she was on travel or something. And then she testified, I think, on the 17th of this month. I don't exactly know the date, but she did testify, and then she went and called for the police. And it's outrageous that you're calling the police for no other reason than people exercising their right to free speech, the right to the First Amendment. So they're the ones, they're the ones under the pressure from right-wing groups, under the pressure from donors like Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, for instance, who donate a great deal of money to Columbia. Other universities, Harvard was by Aikman, a hedge fund billionaire who made his money by stealing other people's money and so on. Without going into these details, but we know that these universities have been, by and large, hamstrung and directed in many ways by donors, and the students spontaneously actually reacting against that, along with, of course, being on the right side of history, wanting to see an end to this horrific war, genocidal war. They want to see a ceasefire. They want to see Palestinians be free. It's a very basic right, and it's a very profound statement. That's what they say. Palestine shall be free. Palestinians shall be free.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to watch the response, because these are overwhelmingly peaceful demonstrations, right? We're not seeing students destroying property and saying, oh, this is in the name of Palestine or anything like that. No, they're literally setting up camps, kind of creating their own communities on these college campuses. And that has become kind of a thorn in the side of a number of politicians, both Democrat and Republican. And speaking of the Biden administration, how they've responded to it, Joe Biden himself has called these demonstrations anti-Semitic. Oh, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has done the exact same, even though a number of Jewish groups are involved in the protests. Now, I know that you had an exchange with the State Department last week where you pointed out that Netanyahu is calling for a crackdown on these protests, and it seemed like Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel didn't see the same headlines. Maybe he missed the ones that the rest of us saw and claimed that that wasn't the case. Why do you think that the Biden administration is allowing a foreign leader to essentially dictate U.S. policy here at home?
Yes. Every time I ask a question in the State Department, they always tell me that Israel is a sovereign state. We cannot tell them what to do and so on. But here we are, a country that is almost totally dependent on the U.S., billions of dollars, your tax money, my tax money, everybody else's tax money goes to sustain this horrific war and so on. And then you have this leader of that country who's basically besieged in his own country. There are demonstrations calling for his dismissal and so on, or for a new election. And he comes out and he says, by God, they should crack down on these demonstrators and so on. And that is really gross interference. Yet the State Department did not see fit to say we should not allow foreign leaders to interfere or dictate or say or call for violence against American citizens who are exercising their basic right. I asked him, I tried to give him a way out. And I said, listen, we condemn, we certainly condemn any kind of police brutality against Americans here in this country exercising their rights. And, I tried to give him this kind of segue to give him a way out, but he did not. They insisted that Netanyahu is not calling for that. And Netanyahu and his spokespeople, they come out and they say, no, we are calling for a crackdown. They're not shying away from that, whether in those words or in phrased differently and so on. So, yeah, I mean, this is we see, and it's really very dangerous when the president comes out and says these demonstrations are anti-Semitic. He's basically giving a free hand, not only to smear, but for physical violence against them. Remember, in Colombia, we've seen students who were actually serving in the or had served in the Israeli army, and they spray paint things and so on, and call demonstrators names and so on. The violence is coming from the pro-Israeli groups. We've seen that this past weekend. I mean, I walked through George Washington on Friday, and I saw how peaceful it was. People are chanting, people carrying flags, carrying the Palestinian kafia, and so on, and basically demanding some, quite righteous demands and so on. They're saying we need, those who are arrested, we need the charges dropped. We need you to quit aiding this occupation. We need you to divest. I mean, that's exactly what happened under apartheid, during apartheid in South Africa. We remember how the University of Berkeley, I mean, this is recent history for me, in 85 and so on, when they did exactly the same thing, and they called for divestment and proved that they were actually on the right side of history. So it is exactly what we see now. And although it is not organized in the sense that you don't have the steering committees and things like this, and funds being raised, we see that these students have a momentum. They will continue to do it. I don't think they will be deterred. I don't think they will be intimidated. They feel that they are right. They have amazing energy and so on. And remember, these are Gen Zers. If Biden loses them in the election, he's going to lose the elections. So that's what he should keep in mind. I'm not saying that these demonstrations are used in a way to extort concessions from Biden, but quite the contrary. They're saying, we want this to end, because they know, Rachel, as we discussed, you and I, many times before, Biden and this administration have the ability, have the strength, have the power and the leverage to basically stop this genocide now, period. Stop it now, Instead of stopping it, they send $26 billion of more aid, military aid to Israel. Instead of stopping it, we see the Speaker of the House going out there to Colombia and say, crack down on these students, bring them in. I mean, I remember what happened in Kent State back in 1970. I remember that. And a lot of people, of course, my generation remembers that and so on. So this is what they are calling for. We see today like 21 Democratic congressmen saying that Colombia must crack. I mean, they use that word, crack down on these protesters and so on. So the right wing and the pro-Zionist groups are basically coming unhinged. They're becoming unhinged. We see what ADL is saying, what AIPAC is saying, and so on. But the good news is, the more they do this, the more momentum this movement gains, and I think we will see even more campuses protesting.
Yeah, it seems like the more that they try to really crack down, the more the movement spreads. And it's always strange to me watching some of these, and I would add a lot of Republicans in on this, because they're the ones who typically are more pro-Israel, but now all of a sudden they're against these protests. And it's like, why not just let them happen? And you can say, hey, I don't agree with what they're saying. However, they have the right to protest under the First Amendment. That is one of our most important rights here in this country, that we are supposed to. Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, the bedrock of American democracy, supposedly. Yeah.
Unless you criticize Israel, that is what has become
this is the thing, right? Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this point. I think what we see, and this is the significance of this movement, it used to be progressive except for Israel, for Palestine. You can be progressive on all issues except for Palestine. You have to be a pro-Israel. I think this is changing. I think what we see today is that people are realizing that the struggle for Palestine, the struggle for the freedom of the Palestinians, the struggle to end the occupation, is really part and parcel. It's at the center of the progressive struggle, for women's rights, gay rights, Black Lives Matter, all these things, So that's what we see, and that is a good thing.
Yeah. Now, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was also how this relates to what's currently going on in Gaza, because I know that, looking at Netanyahu right now, I'm thinking he is so grateful for any kind of distraction, right? He's saying, look over
Right.
here at these terrible students in the US, don't pay attention
Right.
to all of the Palestinians dying in Gaza. There's been some talks that maybe we could see some sort of a hostage deal that would delay Israel's planned ground invasion of Rafah. But it seems like that's what they're set on. How do you see that back and forth there? It seems like Netanyahu is determined to go into Rafah, even though he hasn't presented any kind of humanitarian plan for the Palestinians there.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, this Rafah thing, first of all, I think Netanyahu is using it to extort, to place pressure on Hamas and others and so on, and the negotiators, on the U.S. And many others. But also, they are attacking Rafah. I mean, yesterday they killed 13 medics. They killed 13 medics in Rafah. So they're bombing, they're killing, scores of children in Rafah have been killed over the past week. We don't know how many, but dozens upon dozens of people, men, women, children have been killed. So anyone that tells you Rafah is not under attack, it is actually under attack, So Netanyahu is basically is losing it because he's losing the battle on in the battlefield, in the sense that they have done the same thing in Gaza, they have done the same thing in the north, they have done the same thing in Khan Yunis, and so on, all under the pretext that we're going to go in and free the hostages, and they have not been able to free not one hostage. So quite the contrary, they killed the 3 hostages that were saying, "Come and take us, we are free." So it's he's definitely trying to deflect, as you put it. He's trying to tell people, look, we are all alone now. These terrorists have taken over U.S. campuses and so on, which is of course not true. I mean, we see demonstrations in Israel, in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and so on. So it is natural. I mean, we've seen that the college campuses in America have always been a beacon in a way. They have always lived the way. That was true during the war in Vietnam. That was true against apartheid. It was true in the civil rights movement and so on. We all remember the 3 kids that were killed in the South back in 63 or 62, 63. They were going around registering voters and so on, black voters. They were students. They were doing this as a volunteer and so on. So the students have always been in the forefront of the struggle. And I think this will continue. We see it not ebbing, but rather expanding.
Yeah, certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. Saeed Arikat, a Palestinian journalist, Washington bureau chief for the Al-Quds daily newspaper, and adjunct professor at American University. Thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Thank you. Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.